So here we are again in a freezing cold garage at a time when I should be in my bed working on my car. Nothing's really changed there then. Now what we're doing today is nothing really too interesting. We're just going to do a bit of a basic service on the Honda Elise, starting off with an air filter. Then we'll change out the oil filter and also swap the oil. So this is also an air filter. It chops up the germs and the air can... Alright, you caught me. We're turboing the Honda Elise. So here on the table in front of us we can see the main components of the exhaust side of our turbo build. As with any turbo build, the turbo itself is the heart of it, and in our case it's a Garrett GT3071R. Now the reason I've gone for the 71 over the slightly larger, more popular 76, which you do see on many Honda builds, is simple. Now the 76 does have more max horsepower at max boost. But the thing is, I'm never going to max this turbo out, so that really doesn't matter. The important thing for us is that this spools faster, which means it's on boost faster, which means it makes the power further down the rev range. And on a car that's on track, spool time is everything. As for why I've gone with Garrett, well, there's been a couple of turbo builds come out of this garage, from twin-turbo V8 Golfs to a turbocharged Lotus Exige, all of which were powered by Garrett. So I've seen them work and I know they're reliable. Tying this to the engine is the exhaust manifold. Now this brings the gases out of the head and up into our turbo to keep it spinning. This is a very simple log style design where you've got this log bit here, some branches onto the flange. To let excess pressure out of that manifold, we have this, our wastegate. In my case, a Tile MVS. It's a well-known brand, they're solid and reliable, and it means they're not going to stick and end up blowing up my engine. So what we need to do now is to take our manifold, get it on the car, get everything mocked up in position, work out where the turbo flange is going, and where my wastegate flange is going, and then we can get everything tied together and finish up the manifold itself. So let's get to it.
Before we can mock up our new exhaust, we have to remove the old one. So first of all we get the car up in the air, remove the boot lid to give us access from the top, remove the boot firewall to give us access from the rear, and then we come underneath the car to remove both the diffuser and the main under tray. Now that we can get in from the bottom, we unbolt the exhaust from the silencer and from the head, and then pull the manifold up through the top. Now we can bolt our manifold up to the head and check where the turbo is going to sit. Now I don't really like the compressor housing pointing out into the boot like this because I'm trying to save at least some of that space. So I'm going to loosen off all of the bolts and rotate the housing in a process called clocking so that it comes out the top. There we go, much better. While I'm here I'm also going to check where my wastegate's going to sit and ensure that none of it fouls the turbo.
So now that we've mocked everything up in the car, it's time to make our completed exhaust manifold. Now the way we're going to do that is by taking this turbo flange and this wastegate flange and welding them onto the main log. However, it's not as simple as just welding these directly on. As you can see, for one, they get in each other's way. For two, well, you've got all these gaps around the holes that would let the exhaust gas vent to atmosphere. Now that would cause all sorts of problems. So what we've got to do is make some simple extenders. In the case of the wastegate flange, this is simple. We simply weld it to a short bit of pipe and weld it on the front. For the turbo flange, however, this is somewhat more difficult. As you can see, the pipe just isn't big enough to cover it all, and we're right back at square one with all of the exhaust gas venting out the side of this flange. So what we're going to have to do is cut this in two, notch it, and then fill in the spaces with a little bit of steel plate. So we'll get onto that momentarily. First of all though, I want to talk a little bit more about turbo clocking. Now as I showed you earlier, you can loosen these bolts around the side to rotate your compressor housing. However, you can also do the same thing around here to rotate your turbine housing. And in fact, if you want to mount your turbo in the bottom of the manifold instead of the top, that's actually how you would rotate these round to fit. If you do that, however, you need to make absolutely sure that this oil drain here faces downwards. The oil in a turbo drains via gravity, so if this is pointing upwards, the oil can't drain out, which means that your turbo can't get lubricated or cooled, and the full thing cooks itself. Now with that little warning out the way, let's go on to making this manifold.
Now we need to notch some tube using a paper stencil to mark it up, and an angle grinder to cut away at it. We then do a bit of final shaping with a flat disc. Now we can fire up the bit. Oh, that's not a good noise. Right, let's get this thing apart and see what's going wrong. It looks as though the idler wheel is seized. Now this spins round and the saw rides round on it. If that doesn't turn, the saw doesn't move. So we need to remove this wheel from the shaft, get it all nice and oiled up to make sure it's all freed off. At this point it should spin freely. smooth. So now we can put the bandsaw back together, get the blade on there and tension it all up. With that done, it's time to saw some pipe. And saw more pipe. And then saw a bit more pipe. Now we cut one of our notches in two to make the turbo flanges, however it's a bit too round to fit our square hole. So I put it into my finely calibrated precision squisher and squish it. With that done, we can weld up the manifold around all of the bends and branches, followed by our two flanges, to give something that looks something like this. Now we can measure up the turbo flange itself and cut some plates to fill in those gaps. Now we need to know where this is going, so I'll bolt the turbo to the flange and mark onto the manifold where it's going to go. This is then followed by marking around the inside so I know where I need to cut. I can rough this shape out with the grind end, but to actually do the final shape, I'm going to swap to a pneumatic die grinder. I'm wearing the thickest gloves I can find here. Not to protect my hands or anything, but just because in a negative 2-degree garage, this thing gets absolutely freezing. Once that's done, it's time for even more welding. And then we can move on to shaping the wastegate flange to fit the manifold via the ancient and lost art of steel whittling. Then we've got a final spot of welding just to hold it all together. With that done, we want to port our manifold. Now this removes any unevenness, especially in the remaining factory welds of the flange where I cut off the old manifold, and just make sure all of the air flows smoothly. I also do where the turbo flange meets the manifold, just with some carbide cutting bits, and then moving up onto some stones. With that done, it's time to put everything together for our final fit on the car. We get the wastegate sitting in where it will go underneath the turbo, then bolt the actual turbocharger itself down on top of the manifold. Now I don't know about you guys, that looks pretty decent to me.
Well, that looks like a completed turbo manifold to me. We can take exhaust gas in, put compressed air out, and we can even get rid of the excess. So, job done. I'll see you at the next bit. Oh, hang on. Oh no, we've got an extra hole here. Oh, we've got another one down here. I've missed something. What could it be? Oh yeah. You see, turbos spin fast. And by fast, I mean really fast. Now to do that, they need some pretty fancy bearings to keep the shafts in line and spinning. In the case of my turbo, a Garrett GTR, I've got ball bearings. Some older turbos might have journal bearings. And the thing about bearings is they need oil. In here at the top, we can see the oil feed port. No prizes for guessing what that one's for. It brings the oil feed in from the engine to the turbo. And down in the bottom, we have the oil drain port. If you can guess what that one's for, you win a rubber ducky. The only thing to note with a drain port is a turbo is mostly drained by gravity, so you want it facing as close to directly downwards as possible. Otherwise, if it comes out the side or the top, your oil's not really going to go anywhere. It'll just sit in this central housing, it'll cook, and then it'll cook your bearings. And if your bearings cook, the turbo destroys itself. None of those things are good. It's just a sad time all round. So let's keep our drain ports downwards. The oil itself is brought into the turbo by a bit of line like this. It then goes to a tiny fitting, such as this one, that just screws in there. The important thing to note with these fittings is they've got small restrictors in them. A turbo can't actually handle the entire pressure of an engine oil system. If they do so, well, it just blows out the seals, your turbo burns oil, and we're back to turbos destroying themselves. And we've already established that's not a fun time. Some turbos, such as this GTR, already have restrictors built in. This is fine, you can still use these fittings, it's just make sure that the restrictor is the same size or larger than the one in your turbo. That way it doesn't really affect the system. On the engine side of things, instead of tapping into the block itself, we've got a little T-piece. This side goes into the block, and then your oil pressure sensor goes in here. We then take a T off here, and the line taps into it. There we go, we've got an oil feed, just like magic. You don't even have to tap the block and deal with any of the swarf or nastiness involved in that. Draining the turbo is simpler. We just take this big barb fitting and bolt it on the bottom. We now attach a pipe to that, and then take it to another barb fitting, which will be tapped into our nice aluminium sump. Easy that. So that's enough talk about fittings, restrictors and sumps. How about we get the oil out, the sump off, start tapping things, and get everything plumbed in.
Step 1 of removing any sump is to drain the oil. Well, unless you've got some sort of deep-seated hatred of your garage floor, that is. Once that's all drained, we can start pulling out all the sump bolts around the side and the two hidden behind the flywheel. Try not to drop too many on the floor, or get hit in the face by them. With those bolts out the way, it's pretty easy to pop the sump off using the pry points around the bottom of the block, and then just lift it out the way.
So here you can see I've got my sump off. Now, as you can also see, no matter how good a job you do of draining out your oil, you'll always end up with a little bit of excess in the bottom. And I'm going to drain that into a tub in a minute. But first of all, I want to show you something. You'll notice these two plates. These are called baffles, and effectively they're just fences that keep all your oil in the centre of the sump. Of course, not all of it. That would cause problems. We'd only have a third of the oil capacity, and engines don't like it when you don't give them enough oil. So what we've got are hinges in each one. This will allow it to flow in one direction but not the other. For example, the oil over here can flow into the centre, but the hinge here will stop it from flowing to the left. If it wants to get out into the outer extremities, it has to flow under small gaps under the plates. So for example, say you're doing a hard corner to the left, all of your oil builds up against the wall and then slowly trickles under. Let's say we change over and go to the right, builds up and then slowly trickles under. Or in this case, it trickles through the big hole that's there for the oil pickup. But once that's in the way, that's less of a problem. Now effectively what this does is it keeps enough oil in the middle under hard cornering to prevent oil starvation when you're on track. A lot of cars can kind of get away without these, however things like the Honda Elises, it's well documented, especially when you put sticky tyres on them, that when these get out on track, they have a bit of oil starvation. So that was my way of fixing that. It's my very low budget method, and you can get some nice fancy bolt together clockwise motion things that drop in there that will solve the problem for you also. So I just wanted to show you that. Next up, we're going to work out where we're going to drill and tap this to put my oil drain. So after having a little look around the sump for a bit that's thick enough to take the tap, but also flat enough for me to thread this barb into, I've come up with this bit. And by come up with, I mean Honda put it in there for their sump plug, and I'm going to copy them. Now we want it nice and high so it's above the oil level, so I'll mark off a bit, run some drills through this, and then get the tap going.
When drilling a hole this size, it's always worth remembering to start small and work up the bits. And a bit of cutting fluid doesn't hurt either. Now that we've got it all drilled out, we can fit our tap into the tap wrench and... well that's a problem.
So I've come up with something of a solution. Now, if there's any machinists that have made the mistake of watching this video, I apologise for what you're about to see. Step 1. I found a socket that fits this tap. Now, I know you're already screaming at the screen, but it's not as bad as it looks, trust me. However, it's not much better. Before ratcheting sockets, you had these kind of little adapters that had a hole through the side and a bar that went through it. Now, if you look at this, it looks almost like a tap wrench. And I'm hoping this makeshift little tap wrench here will get the job done. So let's test it out.
So that tap wrench actually works pretty well. Although I did need a much bigger bar for that 1/2 inch tap. I ended up with a huge socket extender through there. But in the end, it all threads in nicely. So let's get the sump back on. It's important to always clean the mating surfaces on your sump, preferably with something that isn't steel if your sump is made of aluminium. That way you can't gouge any of the flat surfaces. Now luckily for me I drained the oil yesterday, so while I'm in underneath here I don't need to worry about getting dripped on. Otherwise it's one of those keep your mouth closed and try not to swallow the oil type deals. Now with a little bit of sealant applied to our sump and spread about to make sure we've got an even coating, it's time to pop it back onto the car. Make sure the dowels are fully located when you do this, and then you can get all of your bolts in and tightened up. Got to watch out though, these little bolts love to shear if you're not careful. Time to get back to that turbo. First we need to get our oil feed adapter threaded in at the top of the turbo. Then we can oh no. Yeah, there we go, that's more like it. With that gone, we can get our drain flange on with a new gasket and move on to the oil supply. The feed's going to come off the oil pressure sensor. To get to this though, I need to remove the VTEC solenoid. That little box there is what makes VTEC kick in yo. Then the sensor can be spannered out and set aside. With that cleared, we can thread our T-piece straight into the block, followed by our oil feed line being fitted to the side of the T and tightened up. Now it's time to thread our oil pressure sensor into its new position and get our VTEC solenoid reinstalled back where it belongs, ready to gap some jettas. With the turbo mounted back in place, we can now attach our feed line into the top of the turbo, and I've used a little P-clip here just to keep the line neat, and because it's one better than an O-clip. Then we can come underneath the turbo to fit our drain pipe. I'm making sure here to use oil resistant hosing, coolant line doesn't really like this stuff. Then we just run it down to its position on the sump and fit it snugly to the barb.
And that's pretty much how you bolt a turbo to an engine. You get your manifold to bring the exhaust in, your wastegate to dump the exhaust out, and a way to feed it a nice amount of oil. That keeps it happy. Now that we're making boost though, we need a way to cool that charge air down before it hits the throttle body. And also we can't just have the exhaust dumping out into the boot. That would cause some issues, especially if you go for a picnic. I don't think cool bags are rated to stand up to, well, this kind of heat. So I don't know which one of those will come first. I am halfway through doing the charge cooler. A lot of this is happening at the same time. But the problem is, we're in lockdown with this whole coronavirus thing. So I'm only really waiting for one more thing to do my exhaust, but a couple of more things to do my charge cooler. So it depends what arrives first on what I can do. The couriers are starting to struggle a bit, and getting a hold of some stuff is taking a while. The upside is, I'm going to be in this garage pretty much constantly for 3 weeks to a month, because I have nowhere else to go. Which means there's lots of time to work in this car, and film it for you guys. So I hope you've enjoyed watching this, and I hope you'll join me in the next one, whatever video that ends up being.